Over to you, Mick. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you all for joining, and thank you for sticking around after a comfort break. Can't always take that for granted. So let's just give you a brief introduction, if I may, first of all. I'm an identity and access management solution consultant at OpenText. As of January this year, before that, we were Micro Focus, a global organization headquartered in the UK with some 12,000 staff across maybe around 350 different product disciplines within the organization. As of January, we were acquired by OpenText. We've got a new brand of the OpenText Cybersecurity. We're now a Canadian organization headquartered in Waterloo, and we've now got around 26,000 staff and around 700 discrete products that take us to market. Within my area, this is the OpenText Cybersecurity, we have several go-to-market brands. We have my area, which is NetIQ, Identity and Access Management. We have ArcSight for security operations. We have Fortify for application security, and Voltage for data security. It's a large cybersecurity platform, so I'm just declaring my vested interest in this. I am an industry veteran of around 25 years, and I've had 5 years working with the NetIQ portfolio. Before that, I've worked with lots of other different vendors, from physical access control systems all the way through to PKI and the high levels of authentication and MFA. But that's not what you need to hear about. So what I would like to talk to you today about is a survey that we conducted jointly between one of our partners, Turnkey Consulting, and CyberRes, the brand that I represented within Micro Focus. It was a survey that we conducted in 2022 with the aim of establishing a view of cybersecurity resilience, or the perception of that, across a wide range of higher education establishments. By giving professionals across the higher education sector clear visibility of their perceived state and that of their peers, we hope to help people understand where you may be lacking in the security provision and how to target areas for maybe a prioritized improvement. Cybersecurity professionals from several organizations, it was over 20 organizations, I think, that actually polled at the end of the day. They took part in the survey, giving us a broad range of different views and helping us to draw some comparisons and also some anomalies from those results. And a huge thank you, it goes out to every organization that took the time to take part. And I hope you'll find some of the results interesting, maybe even surprising. So we started off by asking how well prepared each organization was to manage cybersecurity threats. 47% of respondents felt that their organization had only average or limited cover for cybersecurity and cyber resilience. Higher education, like all sectors, is feeling the brunt of an increasingly volatile cybersecurity threat landscape at present. It's making the need for resilient cybersecurity provision even more important. It's therefore surprising to see that nearly half of higher education institutions feel that the cyber resilience is lacking or average, suggesting that you're aware you need to improve, but have yet to take the action to build up that resilience. Given the sensitivity of the systems, the data, the research, and personal information involved in a higher education establishment, striving for a higher level of resilience is an absolute necessity. You're really no different. In fact, you're probably a greater concern than many of the other organizational sectors out there in the commercial space. So why is there such a lack of security provision? Is it knowledge? Is it funding? Academics researching the threat will be a great source for research, in my opinion, a good area for some proposed research programs, because it's difficult for every organization, regardless of the academic space or the commercial space, to stay one step ahead, or at least in tow with the bad threat actors and all the various methods that they're using to exploit systems. Maybe it's down to high staff turnover, and maybe the need for more onboarding and account management processes for students. There's all sorts of different factors in there. When we polled for comments, we got the following back. So 50% of respondents felt their organizations had only average or limited cybersecurity. So the quote that really resonated for me was, it is usually down to budget. It's been hard to get stuff in. Getting that level of cover and being more proactive rather than reactive has been key. So relaxing the purse strings requires changing hearts and minds. Like Simon's experiences earlier, there's often a blind spot about what it means to stop all IT services, or indeed what it means to build up a cyber resiliency practice within an organization. We can't expect funding without education. The stakeholders need to understand why this is so important and why it's necessary. To me, it's a rather perverse situation for the education sector to be in, where there is a need for that education. Anyway, moving onwards, we then asked what percentage of cyber attacks had been discovered and halted before significant harm had been inflicted. 58% of respondents said that they discover and stop under 80% of the cybersecurity attacks that they face. It's important to put this finding into a more detailed context, as there are two potential contributing factors here. The first is that the problem of discovery. Institutions aren't necessarily detecting the attacks until after there's been an impact. The second is the mitigation, discovering the threat but not being able to prevent it from causing further harm. Either way, the response demonstrates that a large proportion of respondents are failing to stop at least 1 in every 5 attacks. And it shows that generally there's a lack of confidence in the defenses that they would like to have in place. We called out in the chat between the sessions the time between the attack or the infection and the detection being critical. How long does that attacker have to execute their payload or to infiltrate the organization whilst undetected? And how do we ensure that those controls are in place to ensure that once an organization is attacked, the lateral movement within an organization is minimized, but narrowing that time between the detection and the action can make all the difference. So less than 80% stopped. Let's remember that the anticipated cost of a single breach, never mind the 20% that got through. Education, again, is key, and so is the proactivity. Awareness that the environment in which your technology exists and the way it works, the patching, the vulnerabilities, the API security, an additional attack vector that's often left unplugged, all need to be considered. Understanding the breadth of that vulnerability and the breadth of the exposure is absolutely key. I could show my age and talk about software development back when I was doing it and how we actually cranked a lot of code by hand. Nowadays, a lot is based around APIs and plugins and pre-written code. Each need to be scanned and assessed for their own vulnerabilities. And it's not a fixed point in time. These are constantly changing and updating scenarios. We asked also about the perceived cyber attack frequency. This is perceived. And for each establishment, 88% detected at least 1 attack a day, or perceived that they were having at least 1 attack a day. 9% said monthly, 3% said yearly. Sorry, let me just jump back there. Let's just think about this. Higher education institutions are subject to attacks constantly, from both the inside of the perimeter, but also outside that perimeter as well of their network. So it's positive that the vast majority of respondents are aware that that's at least the case. This helps to improve the understanding of the need to protect the systems, the data, and the applications 24/7, and to put in place the necessary measures to combat these attacks proactively. So understanding that there is a problem is the first step to that prevention and empowerment. Attacks on sensitive information can be highly damaging wherever they take place. So a constant state of vigilance and resilience is as a continual challenge faced across all the service institutions. But what's being used to detect the attacks? How trusted is that information? Are you confident that all the attacks are being spotted? And what types of attacks are you able to identify? Are some of those simply flying under the radar? 85%, over 85% of respondents felt that they were being attacked at least daily. Now, why is that? Are universities soft targets? Are there disgruntled ex-students who have seen the systems from the inside and perhaps feel like they deserved a first-class degree? I shouldn't take that sort of view, but it's simply a case that IT and security provision is a sector that has swollen, it's grown, it's changed, and it's at such a level that it has outpaced the resourcing that universities are generally able to provide to manage it. And in the case of a hostile actor being in the network, who do they turn to? 53% of respondents said that they had an average or weaker protection against impersonation attacks. An impersonation attack is when an attempt is made to gain unauthorized access to data, applications, or systems by pretending to be an authorized user. These attacks are becoming increasingly commonplace across all industries, but the culture of knowledge sharing, such as research, makes higher education especially vulnerable to this type of threat. The fact that the majority of respondents don't feel like they have good protection against these attacks is a significant concern that all institutions should look to address as part of their cybersecurity strategies. Isn't MFA being implemented at all stages to ensure that identities of users can be asserted? And usernames and passwords, we all know they can easily be copied and have no real attack protection. Entitlements to implement stronger controls to prevent this sort of attack provide better protection. If you have MFA controls, why aren't they being utilized and implemented? Is there a barrier to that implementation? Some organizations are able to assert identity controls so they can block impersonation attacks. As I said, MFA, multi-factor authentication, is critical. There's no excuse in this day and age not to implement and enforce its use across the estate. I currently manage and work with around 30 different authentication factors for my customers and my partner organizations. Now, not all of those different factors are appropriate or even indeed necessary across all organizations, but even an implementation of a very low-level multi-factor authentication can help to prove not only who you are, what you know, who you are, what you have. All of these various elements stacked upon each other provide a far greater level of protection than a single point of failure by using passwords, but also being able to assert different levels of MFA controls based around the risk of any perceived activity or threat level within the organization is key as well. Being able to turn the dial up when you need to jump through more security hoops because there's a greater risk to the organization. You should be able to adapt the MFA beyond simple use of an SMS password. 91% of people said they were targeted as much as, or possibly even more, than the commercial sector. Security professionals within the higher education space generally perceive themselves as a softer or easier target than commercial organizations, a feeling that's reflected by this result. Now, much of this is down to the higher education sector, mainly comprising of open academic institutions with large and highly accessible networks to suit free information sharing within that community, combined with a large number of leavers, joiners, and movers each year. So we need to keep track of the entitlements from that identity life cycle as actors or identities are introduced and depart from the systems. Academic sectors also have an exceptionally high volume and variety of user types, including external and temporary users. If anything, these characteristics only serve to underline the importance of increased cyber resilience and identity governance beyond the commercial sector. The figures reinforce the belief that much of the cybersecurity attacks reported or detected globally are targeting the theft of intellectual property or personally identifiable information. Academic institutions have got both of these types of data in very, very large quantities. The intellectual property, whether from academic program content or funded research, is also incredibly lucrative and provides a unique selling point for many organizations. The high churn of identities as students join or leave the academic courses each year provides swathes of fresh identities to harvest for any successful hacker. The payoff for a successful attack can be particularly rich, as we've seen with the example stated earlier. So most respondents feel that the education sector is targeted quite heavily, but the views of those experts were mixed. Sometimes it was deemed that the vulnerability of the sector is simply because they're seen as an easy target. There was no real coalescence of that information. A particularly timely question asked about the impact of distance learning. So do you feel there's been a rise in identity or unauthorized access related incidents since distance learning was introduced? Well, 44% said yes, 35% said no, 21% were simply still unsure. Now, that rise of distance and remote learning, both during and after the worst pandemic that we've seen in living memory, brings with it inherent risks related to managing and governing identities and the risk of unauthorized access. This is for a number of reasons. Household internet connectivity and the use of BYOD type devices tend to have lower security levels. Remote users need the servers to be more accessible, and more devices and endpoints mean an increased attack surface to exploit. Despite this, more than half of the respondents hadn't noticed any rise in these issues. While some institutions may believe that they genuinely haven't been affected, market research points towards these attacks becoming more frequent and more targeted in the past 18 months. These results could simply reflect a lack of awareness of this issue or sufficient data to report on within any given institution. Maybe it's because academic institutions have all adopted MFA at the point of entry, so they're not subjecting themselves to any unnecessary risks after all. Striking the balance between security and usability is key. And with MFA, multi-factor authentication in place, hats off to you all for making security assessments and implementing them if that's the case. As stated in the research comments, remote learning has always been there for us. Maybe you are ahead of the curve in the academic space. Maybe you adopted and embraced the remote learning or remote access before the rest of the commercial sector. Email and passwords are exposed for the academic sector, but they're problems across the entire industry. We then surveyed perceptions around the leading impacts of data breach. Would you like to guess what the leading impacts were? Well, number one was reputational damage of the institution. Secondly was the loss of data. Third came financial loss, and fourth was non-compliance with regulation standards. It's interesting to see reputational damage ranking highest amongst institutions' concerns relating to data breaches, because the higher education sector as a whole is fully appreciative that if they're seen to be digitally insecure, then it becomes much harder to attract and retain staff and students, as well as attract commercial investment and research funding accordingly. While loss of data and financial loss both have a more direct and tangible effect, it's also reassuring to see that non-compliance is recognized, at least, as robust security is generally made much easier to maintain when higher education institutions adopt a mature compliance framework. And there are a number to choose from. In the increasingly digital world, knowledge of a security breach or a data leak from any type of organization is difficult to hide from. Organizations have a duty and an obligation to report any breach, so simply hiding under the carpet isn't an option. It's easy to see how a bank that is robbed on a weekly basis is insecure and would make most investors think about whether or not to deposit life savings in there. But revenues from academic or research programs is just at risk as the bank if it can't be protected. No organization wants to be headline news with reputational damage, but I still think there's a real positive message that we've just heard from Northumbria about the steps that were taken to get back on track, to not let it beat the university, to not stop life as we know it, but actually to recover and to learn the lessons from doing so. No organization wants to be in the papers, and I think sharing the information and lessons learned from Northumbria have been incredibly valuable. It was a white knuckle ride for everybody to listen to, and I'm amazed you haven't aged more than you have, Simon, during that particular episode. 44% of organizations surveyed said they felt their organization would have limited financial impact after a breach. So taken at face value, nearly half of respondents feel that a breach would have limited financial impact. I think it's quite surprising. However, maybe this goes some way to explaining the results from the previous question, where financial loss ranked third amongst institutions' data breach concerns. Nonetheless, this does suggest a potential lack of awareness across the sector of just how financially damaging a breach can be, especially when the wider knock-on implications of staff and student recruitment are taken into account. Consider the costs of a data breach. GDPR quoting the figures for a breach of PII. The academic sector is not exempt, and nor am I suggesting that you believe it is. Experts' views varied across the board as to why the insights were as they were. They generally referred back to the issues of reputational damage, emphasizing that a university is judged based on its position and its perception within the marketplace, and certainly did not want to lose any additional funding through research or student fees. 44% of people surveyed said that research was the biggest target for data for cybersecurity criminals, and 32% financial information was the biggest target. This result emphasized for me, again, just how important research is for higher education, being considered a larger target than financial data in this sector alone. Research represents a unique asset that can empower and transform an organization if it's successful, but which equally can be hugely damaging if access to it is not properly secured and the data is stolen or it's leaked. When this result is considered alongside the 88% of respondents who say their institutions are attacked at least once a day, it demonstrates just how vulnerable research can be whenever it isn't adequately secured. Most academic institutions have a large number of students coming and going, so while they may not be the biggest earners at the time of study, much of their personal identifiable information remains the same and could be used and abused by bad actors beyond their time at university. Data excised from a breach can remain dormant for many, many years before it's being utilized, waiting for a greater payload to be exploited in either ransomware or identity theft after the academic time. Essentially, it depends on what research and how sensitive the data the university is holding is the overriding key as to why the information and research is such a prized asset. But there is still a sensitivity of the personal identifiable information of the large academic population. We asked then what were the perceived biggest threats to higher education in cybersecurity threats. Ransomware was a clear leader. Phishing and spear phishing followed along behind, but with 53%, ransomware was the clear leader. According to some of our research partners, 64% in the UK were subject to ransomware attacks in 2022 alone. The cost of remedying attacks like this can cost institutions thousands or even millions. For example, in June 2020, the University of California in San Francisco paid a $1.1 million ransom to regain server access. The reasoning by which they chose to do this came down to them estimating it would have cost over $10 million to retrieve the lost data by other means. However, even paying ransom isn't always a guarantee that you're safe and secure, or that the systems will be unlocked, or that you don't retain some element of malware within the systems. Phishing, second place here, is interesting for me because the vulnerabilities around the impersonation attacks and distance learning mentioned earlier in that report showed potential gaps in higher education institution security. Prevention is always better than cure. Is this point being made about the type of initial attack? The attack types aren't exclusive, and a ransomware attack could often be established by first executing a successful spear phishing attack. As one explained, ransomware is the biggest threat to infrastructure, hardware, and data center resilience. And so it's an area that is getting funding in some of those areas. But citing access to student funds and personal information is still huge. Ransomware needs to be a route into that organization for some of these hackers. And how can these routes now be closed to all but the approved users of the systems? There's a real mixed message coming from that report. But what I took from that series of information disclosures was that organizations are very much on a maturity curve, which align to disciplines and industry paradigms. Assumed trust takes a traditionally siloed approach to security, keeping the bad actors out and offering greater trust within the organizational perimeter. Accounts are managed and entitlements are authorized and controlled. Passwords are managed and can be paired with self-service capabilities to lighten the load on help desks. Access management provides the mechanism to authenticate users to services to which they've been authorized. Zero trust, taking it to the next level of sophistication, tightens those controls and provides greater controls and monitoring. Grant and remove the entitlements with the user's lifecycle. Don't trust, always verify. What's being requested and what's the wider risk to the organization? What's the threat posed by a request? And should greater tests be applied, like stepping up the multi-factor authentication steps? Don't let users carry around permissions with their account on a day-to-day basis. Grant permissions on demand, where necessary, where they're approved, the right person, the right time, the right resource for the right reasons, and then revoke those permissions after use. This is privileged access management. Apply governance control, visibility, and being able to prove and assert that the controls that you build inside the institution are being enforced and are being active. There are no outlier accounts. There are no drone accounts. There is no unclaimed or anonymous accounts in the system that cannot be attributed to a user or a system with the appropriate controls. And then we have adaptive intelligence, taking it to the next level. It's an area that's traditionally been out of reach for most organizations in the commercial sector as well as the educational space, unless they had very, very deep pockets indeed, which brings in concepts like continual assessment of identities, continual analytics, looking at behavior and characteristics of users. What are people doing? Is this behaviorally anomalous? Well, this now is becoming more achievable within a lot of portfolios. And certainly every element that you see here is addressed in my day-to-day work with the OpenText cybersecurity team. We offer a single platform with broad capabilities from end to end. You don't need absolutely everything, but if you need areas to pick out, every element you choose integrates with the next or with another system, from zero trust, assumed trust, or adaptive intelligence. Across that broad cybersecurity portfolio, there are solutions. I apologize, I'm slightly over time, but with that, I thank you very much.